The Daystar world just turned upside down. When Lisa Weiss stepped forward with shocking claims about Doug Weiss, no one expected what would follow. Joni Lamb's silence said more than words ever could, and fans are still reeling. What secret was powerful enough to shake their empire? What truth did Doug try to keep buried? This is the revelation that could end it all. And once you hear it, you'll understand why viewers can't stop talking. For years, Doug and Lisa Weiss looked like the couple everyone dreamed of being. They stood side by side on church stages, smiling as they spoke about faith, love, and commitment. People looked at them and saw perfection, a godly man who led with wisdom and a graceful woman who stood by his side with quiet strength. Together, they built a ministry that inspired thousands. To the world, Doug was the counselor who knew how to save marriages, and Lisa was the supportive wife who embodied everything he preached. But behind that image was a story no one saw. At home, the applause faded, and so did the warmth. Lisa wasn't the radiant woman from the photos anymore. She was tired of waiting for conversations that never happened, tired of smiling when she felt invisible. Doug's world revolved around cameras, conferences, and adoration. He preached about intimacy but lived in distance. Nights that used to be filled with laughter and prayer turned into silence. Lisa would sit at the dinner table, food going cold, waiting for him to come home from another urgent meeting. When he finally did, his eyes were already somewhere else, on the next sermon, the next audience, the next performance. Lisa tried to make sense of it all. She prayed harder, believing that God could fix what felt broken. She told herself that maybe this was just a season, that love required sacrifice. But deep down, she began to feel something she never expected: loneliness in a marriage that looked perfect to everyone else. Doug's charm that once drew her in now felt like a wall she couldn't climb.
And I said, no, Joni, something very bad has happened. And there's been an essay and all of this. Oh, no. And then she defended Pete. He's hurt Pete so much. The Pete that Rebecca and JW wrote a huge letter about. That Pete. The Pete that Rebecca and JW won't let into their home. That Pete is a good guy. She said that Susie was a pathological liar and that she had made these accusations against a very nice man, the chiropractor, who is deceased now, but has a record and attacked her. So I was in shock what Joni was saying to me. I implored her. I said, please reconcile with Jonathan for yourself. That would be the hope. I saw that side of her. I can only say it's nothing like the Joni on television. It's nothing like that sweet person. But I did see that person somewhat in the video where she was talking about Jonathan has been conducting a smear campaign. And I'm like, what are you talking about? I hadn't seen Jonathan conducting a smear campaign. I'd seen Jonathan.
The public saw the smiles, the gentle touches on stage, the posts about God's blessings. They didn't see the distance in his eyes or the tears Lisa wiped away after each broadcast. Their marriage had become a show, polished and rehearsed, performed for the cameras and the congregation. People prayed to have what they had, never realizing that the love they envied was just an illusion. Behind the lights, Lisa's faith was the only thing holding her together, even as her heart quietly began to break. It didn't happen in one explosive fight or one moment of betrayal. The breaking point for Lisa Weiss came slowly, like water wearing down stone. For years, she had been the quiet half of a perfect marriage. People saw Doug on stage, confident, wise, and full of conviction, and they saw her beside him, smiling softly, the image of grace. Together, they looked unshakable. But the truth was, Lisa had been living in silence for so long that she had almost forgotten what her own voice sounded like. Every day followed the same rhythm. Doug left early, always rushing to meet someone, record something, speak somewhere. He'd kiss her on the cheek, a habit more than an act of love, and disappear into the world where he was admired and applauded. Lisa would stay behind, holding everything else together: the home, the bills, the children, the quiet spaces in between. When he came back, it was never really him who walked through the door. His body was there, but his mind was still on the stage. She tried to reach him. Little things at first: a favorite meal, a handwritten note on his desk, a simple "Can we talk tonight?" But Doug always had something more important to do. Later, he'd say, "You know how busy this week is." Later never came. Slowly, Lisa began to realize that she had become a background character in her own marriage, someone who existed to make sure his life ran smoothly. Her emotions didn't fit into his schedule. Her silence became the only way to keep the peace. The hardest moments were the public ones. Sitting in the audience while Doug spoke about love and communication, Lisa would feel her stomach twist. He talked about cherishing your spouse, about listening deeply, about marriage as a sacred partnership. People around her would nod and whisper, "They're such a beautiful example." Lisa would force a smile, clapping like everyone else, even though she could barely breathe. She knew those same words didn't exist in their home anymore. She prayed constantly, not the small, polite prayers people say at dinner, but the kind that come from desperation, whispered into pillows at 2 a.m., eyes red and heart trembling. "Please, God," she would whisper, "help me reach him again. Help him see me." But her prayers seemed to disappear into the same silence that filled her house. Doug was always too tired, too distracted, too devoted to everyone except her. Then came the night that changed everything. Doug was in his office working on a new sermon about emotional intimacy. Lisa stood quietly in the doorway, watching him speak his thoughts out loud, writing notes about understanding your partner's needs. His words were powerful, full of conviction, but his eyes were cold, empty. That was the moment Lisa realized she wasn't living a marriage, she was living a performance. He preached love, but he didn't practice it. He told others how to stay connected while ignoring the woman who had shared his bed for 30 years. It wasn't anger that hit her first. It was grief, the kind that comes when you finally accept that something sacred is gone. She walked back to her room, sat on the edge of the bed, and cried. Not loudly, but with quiet tears that came from years of pretending everything was fine. That night, Lisa stopped asking God to change Doug. Instead, she prayed for strength to face the truth. And that was when her silence started to change. For years, her silence had been about survival, keeping up appearances, protecting the ministry, making sure no one saw the cracks. But now, silence became something else. It became a boundary, a space to breathe, a small rebellion against the weight of pretending. Lisa began to journal again, writing down things she had never dared to say out loud. She wrote about her loneliness, her anger, her fading hope. She wrote to remember herself. When she finally spoke out publicly in 2024, it wasn't with rage or revenge. It was calm, measured, and heartbreakingly honest. Her voice shook at first, but then it steadied. She talked about years of invisibility, about what it felt like to live beside someone who preached love but didn't show it. "I believed in him," she said softly, "but I lost myself doing it." Her words cut through the air like a quiet confession, not an attack, not a scandal, just truth. The world was stunned. Those who had followed Doug for years couldn't believe it. Their marriage had been a cornerstone of faith-based teaching. But as the story spread, people began to see something else. The courage it took for Lisa to tell the truth. She wasn't tearing anyone down. She was simply refusing to carry a lie any longer. For Doug, it was a blow to his carefully crafted image. For Lisa, it was the first breath of freedom. The years of quiet tears, of praying for change, of smiling through pain, they all led to this moment. And for the first time in decades, she didn't feel small, she didn't feel guilty, she just felt real. The silence she had once feared had become her power. She no longer needed validation, applause, or anyone's permission to speak. She had survived what should have broken her, and now her story, raw, painful, and true, was helping others find their voices too. That was the real breaking point, not the end of her marriage, but the beginning of her freedom. The moment she stopped protecting an image and started protecting herself. The woman who once stood quietly beside her husband now stood on her own, and her voice, once silenced, became a light for others still living in the dark. It started with a picture, just one photo that appeared on social media. Doug Weiss standing next to Joni Lamb, both smiling in front of a cross, hands intertwined, eyes shining under studio lights. The caption read, "A beautiful new beginning. God's plan always prevails." Within hours, Christian news outlets picked it up and the comments poured in. People called it divine timing, a testimony of love restored, proof that God gives second chances. But for Lisa Weiss, it wasn't divine. It was devastating. She had barely finished signing the divorce papers. The wounds were still fresh, still bleeding. She was still waking up in the middle of the night, reaching for a man who wasn't there anymore. Then suddenly, there he was. Not as her husband, not as the man she'd spent over 30 years supporting, but as someone else's blessing. It felt unreal, like watching a movie about her own life, rewritten by someone else. The man she had prayed for, cried for, and stood beside through every season was now posing with another woman, calling it destiny. The worst part wasn't the surprise. It was the familiarity. Lisa knew Joni. She had seen her on television, met her at events, exchanged polite smiles and small talk. Never once had she imagined that one day this woman would become Doug's new wife, and that the world would call it a miracle. To everyone else, it was a love story. To Lisa, it was a public erasure of her entire life. Everywhere she turned, there were reminders. Church blogs wrote about Doug's fresh start. Christian magazines shared glowing headlines about the union of two powerful faith leaders. Photos of their wedding spread online. Joni in white, Doug beaming beside her. The same man who once told Lisa he needed more time to heal from their separation was suddenly smiling for cameras, holding hands with his new bride. Lisa scrolled through the comments. Thousands of people blessing their marriage, quoting Bible verses, praising God's timing. Not one mentioned the 30 years that came before. Lisa sat alone in her living room, staring at the screen. Her phone buzzed with messages, some from friends, some from people she hadn't heard from in years. "Did you see?" they asked. "Are you okay?" She didn't answer. What could she say? That it felt like her life had been deleted. That her story, her sacrifices, her prayers, her love had been replaced by hashtags and carefully posed smiles. The Christian world loves a redemption story, but Lisa knew what no headline could capture, that sometimes one person's redemption comes from another's ruin. Doug had built his career on teaching others about faithfulness, commitment, and love that lasts. Now the man who once preached about healing marriages was celebrating his own new one before the last had even healed. The contradiction was hard to ignore, but few wanted to see it. People preferred the fairy tale. It was easier, cleaner. Lisa's children struggled too. They were old enough to read everything online, old enough to understand what it meant. They saw their father smiling in photos with another woman just months after their family had fallen apart. They saw strangers online praising him as an example of God's grace. And they saw their mother, quiet and heartbroken, trying to hold her dignity while the world moved on without her. At night, when the house was still, Lisa would look through old photo albums, pictures of their wedding day, Doug's first church talk, their family vacations, their children's birthdays, the small, precious moments that had built a lifetime. It wasn't anger she felt most. It was grief. Grief for a life she had given everything to, only to see it rewritten with someone else's name. Her friends tried to comfort her. "God will restore you," they said. "Time will heal." But Lisa didn't want cliches. She wanted honesty. She wanted someone to admit how wrong it all felt. She wanted someone to say what she couldn't, that her pain mattered, even if the world didn't want to hear it. As the weeks passed, Lisa noticed something strange. The same people who once called her and Doug the perfect couple now acted as if she had never existed. Churches that had once invited her to speak stopped calling. Friends from ministry circles drifted away. Her name was quietly removed from bios, websites, and social posts. Doug's narrative was being rewritten in real time, and Lisa was vanishing from it completely. She was no longer Lisa Weiss, wife of Dr. Doug Weiss. She was just a shadow, a name that no one mentioned, a woman the story had moved past. It was like watching her life dissolve in front of her eyes. But in that silence, something unexpected began to happen. Lisa stopped scrolling. She stopped reading the comments. She stopped trying to understand why. For the first time in years, she turned off the noise and sat in the quiet. And in that stillness, she realized something she hadn't seen before. She had spent decades trying to hold together a life that wasn't hers anymore. Doug's happiness, his image, his career, she had carried it all, even when it broke her. Now she didn't have to. The pain didn't fade overnight. Some mornings, she still woke up with tears on her pillow. But little by little, the weight began to lift. She started journaling again, pouring her truth into words no one else could twist. She took long walks, letting the air fill her lungs. She called old friends, people who remembered her before all the fame, before the titles. She rediscovered laughter, soft, hesitant at first, but real. The shockwave of Doug's new marriage had shattered her world, but from the cracks, something stronger began to grow. Lisa stopped trying to be part of a story that had erased her. Instead, she began to write her own. She didn't need to explain or defend. The truth, once spoken, no longer needed permission to exist. The world moved on to new headlines, but Lisa didn't care anymore. Her story wasn't about scandal or revenge. It was about reclaiming herself. And as she looked in the mirror one quiet morning, she realized that the woman staring back wasn't the broken wife everyone had forgotten. She was someone new, someone free, someone whole, someone who had finally learned that sometimes being erased from someone else's story is the only way to start writing your own. In the months after everything fell apart, Lisa Weiss woke up every morning in a house that felt too quiet. For years, her life had been full of noise, the constant movement of ministry, travel, and Doug's booming voice filling every room. Now, there was only silence. At first, that silence hurt. It reminded her of what she had lost. The man she once loved, the home they built together, the identity she had carried for more than 3 decades. But slowly, that same silence began to feel like something else. It began to feel like peace. In the beginning, Lisa didn't know who she was without Doug. For so long, she had been the wife of Dr. Doug Weiss, the woman behind the man, the steady figure who made his success possible. She had been the one keeping the home together, raising their children, managing the quiet details that no one ever saw. Her worth had been tied to his world. So when that world collapsed, she felt like she had disappeared along with it. She would wake up, stare at the ceiling, and whisper, "Who am I now?" But life has a way of rebuilding itself in the cracks of what's broken. Lisa started small. She began journaling again, something she hadn't done in years. The first pages were messy, full of tears and confusion, but writing helped her breathe. It was her safe place, where she could be honest without judgment, where she didn't have to smile or pretend to be strong. In her words, she began to rediscover her own voice, the one that had been buried beneath years of silence. She also started taking walks every morning. At first, they were just a way to fill time, to stop the walls from closing in. But as she walked, something began to shift. The air felt cleaner, the sky brighter. She started noticing small things again. The sound of birds, the way sunlight filtered through the trees, the warmth of the wind on her face. These were things she had forgotten while living under the constant pressure of being perfect. In those walks, Lisa started to feel alive again. People around her noticed the change. Her close friends, the ones who had stayed when the rest of the world turned away, saw her eyes soften, her smile return. She wasn't the same woman who had sat in her living room, shattered by betrayal and heartbreak. She was learning to live again, to laugh again, to trust herself again. She began saying yes to small things that made her happy. Lunch dates, church gatherings, quiet weekends away. Little by little, the world started to open up to her again. For so long, Lisa had believed that faith meant enduring pain in silence. But now, she began to see faith differently. It wasn't about pretending everything was okay. It was about believing that God could rebuild something beautiful from what was broken. She started going to church again. Not the big events or the televised services, but small, intimate gatherings where people spoke honestly about their struggles. There, she found community, not performance. People who didn't ask her to smile through her pain, but who sat with her in it. As she began to heal, Lisa also began to let go. Not with bitterness, but with understanding. She stopped replaying the past in her head, stopped wondering why things happened the way they did. She realized that forgiveness wasn't about saying what Doug did was okay. It was about releasing herself from the weight of it. She had carried guilt and anger for too long, believing that if she had just prayed harder or loved better, things would have turned out differently. But now she knew that she couldn't fix someone who didn't want to be healed. There was a moment, months later, that marked a turning point for her. Lisa was sitting on a park bench watching children play when she realized that she hadn't thought about the scandal all day. She hadn't checked social media, hadn't felt that familiar tightness in her chest. She was just there, present, breathing. That was when she understood what freedom really meant. It wasn't about forgetting. It was about no longer being controlled by what had hurt her. She started sharing her story, quietly at first, in small groups of women who had gone through similar pain. She didn't talk about Doug's fame or his failure. She talked about finding herself after losing everything. She spoke about silence, about faith, about the courage it takes to start over. And people listened. Some cried, some hugged her. Many said, "That's my story too." Lisa realized then that her pain hadn't been wasted. It had become her purpose. Over time, she built a new rhythm. She began consulting for small ministries, mentoring women who felt unseen, and volunteering in her community. It wasn't about fame or recognition anymore. It was about authenticity, living in truth, not image. Her home, once filled with tension, became a space of calm. There were candles burning, soft music playing, books scattered on the table, signs of a woman at peace with herself. Lisa didn't erase her past. She accepted it. She could look at old photos now without feeling like she was drowning. She could hear Doug's name without her heart breaking. What once defined her no longer controlled her. Her story had changed, from brokenness to strength, from silence to voice, from loss to freedom. One evening, as the sun set outside her window, Lisa wrote a simple line in her journal. "I survived what was meant to silence me." Then she closed the notebook and smiled. She wasn't just surviving anymore. She was living, freely, fully, and on her own terms. The rise didn't come with fanfare or applause. It came quietly, in moments of stillness, in laughter that felt real, in peace that didn't need to be explained. Lisa Weiss had been through the fire and walked out stronger. She had found her freedom, not in revenge or in being seen, but in finally being herself.